From the moment Meghan Markle sat across from George Stephanopoulos on the Good Morning America set, viewers could feel the undercurrent of tension. Her appearance had been teased all week as a candid discussion about her new documentary and her humanitarian initiatives, but George came prepared with questions that dug deeper than publicity and promotion. His first line of questioning focused on Meghan's portrayal of herself as a victim within both the royal family and the media at the moment. He asked whether she believed constantly positioning herself as the oppressed made her seem disingenuous. Meghan's expression froze. She responded that sharing her truth wasn't about playing a role, but about healing. George pressed further, saying, "Many people now questioned her credibility after so many public appearances seemed more like image control than honesty." The crowd in the studio remained quiet, as Meghan firmly defended her decision to speak out. But the conversation had already veered into hostile territory. George then pivoted to ask if Meghan had ever considered how her words might affect public trust in institutions like the monarchy and the media. Meghan replied that her responsibility was to be authentic, not to preserve outdated structures. George raised his eyebrows and challenged her by saying authenticity without self-reflection could be dangerous. Meghan leaned in, visibly tense, and said that her reflections came after years of silence and suppression. George shot back that many critics believed she hadn't been silenced at all, but had strategically managed her narrative. Meghan's voice grew colder as she said surviving trauma was not the same as manipulating perception. George countered that the public wasn't obligated to believe her simply because she said she was hurt. Meghan paused, clearly frustrated, before stating that dismissing lived experiences was part of the very problem she fought against. The studio remained on edge, sensing that neither guest nor host would back down. The conversation moved into more controversial ground when George asked about Meghan's Netflix deals and podcast series, questioned whether such high-profile commercial ventures were compatible with her claims of wanting privacy. Meghan's response was swift. She argued that there was a clear difference between controlling the narrative and being hunted by tabloids. George then asked if curating one's image for profit made her activism less sincere. Meghan said using visibility to inspire change was a strength, not a contradiction. George fired back, saying it looked more like brand building than activism. Meghan responded sharply, saying that dismissing her work simply because it was on a large platform was reductive. George then said he wasn't dismissing the work but questioning the motives. Meghan gave a cold smile and replied that questioning a woman's motives was nothing new, and that she was tired of defending her right to exist on her own terms. At this point, the tone was anything but friendly. George moved on to Meghan's relationship with the royal family, asking if she felt any regret about the way things had unfolded. Meghan said her only regret was trusting people who never intended to protect her. George questioned whether she ever considered the possibility that her perception was clouded by personal pain. Meghan replied that pain didn't disqualify her perspective. George asked whether she had spoken to her father since the public fallout. Meghan's expression darkened as she said her family issues were not for public consumption. George said they became public when she spoke about them on air and in interviews. Meghan countered that selective transparency is necessary when protecting mental health. George challenged that by asking if her selective sharing was also selective storytelling. Meghan's composure wavered slightly as she firmly denied twisting the truth and accused George of trying to paint her as manipulative. The conversation took a sudden turn when George mentioned the legal battles Meghan and Harry had engaged in with the press. He asked whether those lawsuits were about justice or just a tool to silence critics. Meghan responded that justice isn't silence, it's accountability. George raised a pointed question about freedom of the press and whether Meghan's approach undermined that principle. Meghan replied that freedom of the press should not mean freedom to destroy lives. George retorted that, in a democracy, criticism is part of the deal. Meghan said, criticism is one thing, but character assassination is another. George asked if she believed there was a line between public scrutiny and personal harassment. Meghan answered that line was crossed daily in her experience. George followed up by asking if she felt she had ever crossed a line in her own messaging. Meghan remained silent for a beat, then said it was easy to judge from outside the fire, as Meghan tried to steer the discussion back to her work on women's rights and community outreach. George interrupted, saying many felt her projects were overshadowed by the controversy. She constantly reignited Meghan's face flushed slightly as she insisted the media chose what to focus on. George questioned if she genuinely believed that she had no role in creating the headlines. Meghan replied that headlines chase anything that gets clicks, and her truth was often distorted for profit. George leaned forward and asked if she thought the media narrative would change if she simply stepped away from the spotlight. Meghan looked surprised and said silence doesn't fix anything. George argued that sometimes walking away speaks louder than words. Meghan responded that disappearing wasn't a solution for someone trying to spark change. George raised his voice slightly and asked whether constantly speaking out was helping or exhausting the public's empathy. Meghan's face now showed clear signs of anger and resolve. The air grew even thicker when George asked if Meghan saw herself as a political figure. Meghan said she was an advocate, not a politician. George pressed on, asking if she planned to run for office, as rumors had long suggested. Meghan laughed dryly and said speculation was never in short supply. George responded that the public had a right to know if she was using activism as a springboard. Meghan replied that empowering communities doesn't require a campaign slogan. George noted that most advocates didn't have multi-million-dollar deals and a media empire backing them. Meghan shot back, saying influence should be used responsibly, not hidden. George countered that responsibility includes accepting criticism. Meghan accused him of conflating criticism with cruelty. George defended his tone, saying respectful challenge was the core of journalism. Meghan said what she experienced was far from respectful and accused the media of rewriting her story without her voice. By this point, Meghan was visibly agitated. Her posture remained upright, but her voice had grown cold. George then delivered a question that became the moment of confrontation. He asked if Meghan had ever considered that her actions may have contributed to the ongoing rift between her and the public. Meghan stared at him for a second, then asked if he would ask the same of a man. George replied he would, if the context was similar. Meghan said the context was never similar, and that women in the spotlight are held to impossible standards. George shrugged and said, public life comes with scrutiny. Meghan said scrutiny doesn't excuse disrespect. George asked if she could name one recent interview where she felt respected. Meghan said this one was not on the list. George responded that sometimes the truth isn't respectful, it's just the truth. Meghan stood up and said she didn't come to be lectured, and certainly not to be humiliated on national television. The moment Meghan stood, the audience gasped. George tried to interject, saying they were having a serious conversation. Meghan replied that serious conversations don't require condescension. George insisted his questions were fair, but Meghan said fairness had left the room the moment he decided to interrogate, not interview. George said he gave every guest the same energy, and Meghan said that wasn't the compliment he thought it was. She adjusted her blazer and looked directly at him, saying she hoped he got the ratings he wanted. George remained seated, but his expression was unreadable. Meghan turned and walked off the set, ignoring the producers trying to calm the situation. The camera panned to George, who looked into the lens and said the show would continue with their next guest. The awkward silence was deafening as the broadcast attempted to recover from the walkout team. The aftermath, social media erupted with clips from the explosive interview. Viewers were divided, some praising George for asking tough questions, others condemning the interview as an ambush. Hashtags like I Stand With Meghan and GMO Confrontation trended within hours. Media outlets across the globe replayed the moment Meghan stood up and walked off. Good Morning America issued a brief statement saying the show supports open dialogue even when it's uncomfortable. Meghan's team released a message saying she would not be silenced by antagonistic tactics and would continue to speak her truth. The clash became more than a viral moment. It reignited debates about media treatment of women, public accountability, and the double standards powerful women often face. Analysts on every network dissected the exchange while fans flooded platforms with support or critique, depending on their side of the aisle. What remained undeniable was that Meghan Markle had once again dominated headlines, not through scandal or spectacle, but through her refusal to be diminished.